Oh, hello there. My name is Liesl. This is Liesl's Easel, and today we're painting evergreen trees. Grab your supplies. You're going to want a range of greens. I like for the darkers, like hunter's green, hooker's green, phthalo green, sap green for mid-tones. You want like a yellow green for your highlights. Yellow oxide to add to it keeps it natural and bright. Mars black for shadowing. And then a range of brushes. If I can get it into focus. Really good camera work on my part here. So I want some good stiff bristly brushes to paint my tree branches with. It keeps it looking really needly, makes it look really natural, and the brush does the work for you. And get a range of sizes to help you through the tree process. And then you want some softer bristle brushes for like tree trunks and filling in spaces, especially like the tip tops of trees. So we're going to go through and practice here. And so I'm just using a canvas that's kind of damaged because it's a throwaway anyway. Maybe I'll paint over it and patch it up later. I've mixed some of my dark green with some black just to get a nice shadow. This is going to be the base layer of my tree. Helps get in structure, especially when you're doing silhouettes. And I've painted it pretty flat on both sides. It's got a nice even layer of paint. Now, when I approach the canvas, I want my brush to be pretty straight on. I'm going to come in with just using like the tip corner there to start with the tree trunk. So I got a nice even like little place to start. And as I go down, I can push down a little bit more on the brush if I want like a thicker trunk. So you can kind of decide if you got like a really skinny tree, if you want a really thick tree. It just depends on how much pressure you put on your brush. Now I'll switch to a smaller brush and use just green. This is a hunter's green right here, and I'm using a small blender brush, a little square one. It holds more paint than a liner one, but you can use whatever brush makes you feel happy. And with just a little bit of paint, we're closing in here so you can see, I'm just doing these really light little taps, just sort of like bouncing around the canvas, almost like a light little sponge. And because we have a small amount of paint on the brush, it's making that nice little feathery look of that kind of bristly pine needle texture. And I'm trying to be really careful. You can see if I take a little bit too much paint, how it gets a little bit darker. Sometimes you want that. You want to be a little bit darker near the trunk. But to get that tree needle texture, you really want to be careful about how much paint you have in your brush. So right here, I'm adding a little bit more of the dark to my color. And I'm going to bring in more of a shadow to the inside of the tree, because we want to have more bulk where there's more branches. And so it's going to be darker on the inside of the tree and then lighter on the outside to make it really feel like there's a glow and there's like a nice life to the tree. Now, as I work down, it's going to get a little bit more chaotic. I'm going to get a little denser. I'm going to care a little bit less about my brush strokes because there's more happening in there. It's going to be a little fuller. It's going to be more branches nesting into each other. When I go in with highlights, I like to add just a little bit scattered throughout the tree with the same technique. I'm using a smaller brush here with a really rough bristle. Now I've added yellow oxide to my green because I want my color palette to be a bit more earthy, but you can go really bright, you can go more neon, you can do whatever your heart desires, just as long as it's a lighter shade of green. And you can see I'm getting really bulky in here. I'm letting the paint stick on a little thicker. So we're gonna go in and do a bit more of a silhouette. Again, I've got like a dark color here for my base, going in with that nice thin tree trunk of a line, and I'm coming in with a little bit of a bristly brush. So the same principle I follow for most evergreen trees. I just change up my brush stroke a little bit. So if I want to make a silhouette like of a tree that's like a lodgepole pine out in Central Oregon, or a really dense like Doug fir that's over in the coastal ranges, like it's a very similar thing, just think about the angle of the brush. So here you can see I'm leaving space between the branches and that tree trunk showing, rather than making it a really dense like Christmas tree. The key to this is that you want to keep your brush kind of at an angle so the pine needles sort of floof off the brush. Again, very technical, we're floofing our little needle sprays here. And I want to make sure I've got some variation in the branches. Like I don't want it to like telephone pole across where it's like straight line, straight line. I have a little bit of some variation on where those branches each start. So there's that natural chaos and less of an engineered tree. This isn't a man-made tree. This is a nature tree that's had maybe a hard life and it just needs a little love. So when you're practicing trees, just play around with the different brush strokes. Play around with the trees going side to side, branches growing up, down, sideways. Maybe some are missing. You want to have it feel really natural so it feels like you're in a forest. We're not in a tree farm. There's going to be different heights, shapes, sizes, all that good stuff. This is a natural forest. Let it be a little messy. The main takeaway for trees for me is that small brushes at the top, larger brushes at the bottom to help fill in that space. You don't even have to follow a tree trunk line if you don't want to. Sometimes it's just nice to have that guideline as you work through the process. And the other big thing I really want to remember is that the angle of the brush that I'm painting at. Very rarely do I go straight on with the brush. I'm always at a bit of an angle. I want to catch like a 45-degree angle to that bristle so that I can get those little rogue wishes from those little rough ends going off to make me that nice pine needly texture. Now, when you paint a forest, very rarely are you painting each individual tree. You usually have a bit of a mess of clusters of trees. So when I'm painting like a back line, like a ridgeway, I tend to just kind of fill in the bulk color and then I'll come in and paint essentially like tree tops. So we're using the same brush stroke that we did to make the branches, but we're turning it vertical rather than having it horizontal. So here I'm using the edge of my bristle brush just to kind of catch that side, right? Like 45-degree angle, it's going to get us there. And I'll just do these like little taps slightly upward just to pull the paint off the brush lightly and make that nice sort of almost hairy kind of a spongy texture. And I do almost like this up and down kind of zigzag through the forest blob that I've sort of my like ridge line that I've created to go through and really add that nice tree texture. Again, I don't want to have everything in the same height, same line. I want to have a little bit of a wave to it so it feels like it's real. It feels like it's not engineered. This is nature. It's chaotic. I'm going to say that a lot. Once I have the base of my forest together, I like to go in and add like just a couple little special trees, little tall trees that kind of sneak in, things that have a little bit more detail to help it feel like it's broken up, like it's not as monotonous. And it's just like putting a little, the top of the trees that we were doing larger nestled into our forest. And I'm using just a really small liner brush here, like a number 1 or something like that, and whatever green you are using. And I just paint like a little tree trunk and then I just do like little taps back and forth. You can use whatever brush you feel comfortable with, just something that can have like a light little bit of paint. But just like we did with the big trees, I'll paint a little tree trunk to follow and then just do like nice little taps side to side. These are trees that are really far off in the distance here, so we don't have to be perfect. You know, you only need to give your canvas as much information as your eye needs. And now that we've talked about trees, let's put it to work if you want to go along this journey with me. This is going to be an original painting of mine, kind of in my sort of abstract / realistic series that I do. I'm going to have the trees over there on the left be taller than the ones on the right, so I'm working out where I want my perspective to be. I'm going to speed through this because it's a little boring if we watch it in real time. But for the small trees, I'm going to go through and just use some dark greens and make just more like silhouettes. Do some little variety of trees. I'm going to do a couple realistic ones. Just getting like a little vibe, getting a little scene. This is going to be sort of a Central Oregon kind of feeling, like it's going to be eventually along a creek bed. So I want a little bit of lushness here, but I don't want it to be boring. So going through with my teeny tiny brush, I'm using a liner brush. I believe that's my number 1 liner. I didn't take notes. I'm so sorry. And just putting different types of branches, trying to fill in some spaces, getting some different heights, even though a tree that's further back necessarily in the distance doesn't necessarily need to be smaller. I want to have a little bit of a height change. And then once I have a few trees, I like to go in and just sort of mess in a little bit of some dark green underneath my tall trees just to feel like there's some background in there, like we're filling in the space. Like it doesn't need to be super detailed. I just want to start building up that feeling of a forest. And I'm keeping the colors pretty singular, like it's black and maybe like a little bit of Hooker's green mixed together. Now, as I work forward, I can start bringing in larger trees and more detailed trees, and that's where I'll go back to using like a brush to put maybe a tree trunk in. If you know where your tree is going to live and you know that you're pretty comfortable with making the tree, you don't have to always paint a tree trunk. I just find that sometimes it helps when I'm mapping out where I want them all to live. When I work on a forest, I like to give a little space. Like there's going to be a few trees that are closer to us and there's going to be a few trees that are further back, but they're not always going to be exactly in line. So often I'll jump around and paint trees a little further away from each other just to help build up my forest, kind of help me figure out where I want to plop things. And after I've done a big tree, I'll go in and fill in some background little trees. Now, you don't necessarily have to know exactly what colors you want. A lot of times I'll go through with almost like a silhouette of a forest, have everything be very similar in tone, and then go back in and put in my shadows and my highlights. You know, one of the beautiful things about acrylic is that it layers so well. So if you cover something up, you can always go back and you can find those shapes again, or if you make a mistake, you can cover it up. So if you make a tree that you hate, just paint it up with another tree. And as I work through, I go back and forth between doing focus trees and silhouetted trees. I think it helps break up the monotony. It helps keep the painting process interesting for me when I have the different types of trees to work with. And look at that. I have a paintbrush just in my mouth. Very hygienic of me. That's nice. So for the left side of my painting, I know that I want to have a few more larger trees here. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my silhouetted, a bit more my denser forest background. And you can see that I just kind of wiggle the brush in. I'm mimicking the shape of the trees that I've done before, but I'm really just taking the side of my brush and just sort of moving the paint around in a loose texture just to help fill in the space. And I'm letting it get kind of bristly. So I'll push the paint around until it's really thin. There's a little bit more water to add to this. You can see in this close-up that there's some thin areas and there's some thick areas. Just to help add some variation, I'm letting the brush do the work for me rather than having to remix colors, repaint everything. Just giving ourselves a nice little back layer. Once I have my background of forest sort of loosely put in, I'll go through and paint in a few more silhouettes that have some detail. I'm thinking about my perspective. Further away from me, I can't see as much. As it gets closer to myself, maybe I'll see more detail, but less color variation, and then working forward. Now I'm doing a nice little time lapse through this so we can speed through. But if you wanted to see kind of a close-up reminder of how to make these trees in real time, or real time-ish, I'm again using the edge of my brush to get that bristle factor. Very rarely do I go straight onto the canvas with my paintbrush here. I almost always have that 45-degree angle to it as I paint in those branches. I really want to let the brush do the work for me rather than me having to go paint in like all the individual little splays at a time. Now I'm going to keep speeding up through these painting processes just because it is kind of slow. So as I bring in my kind of larger final trees, I'm going to lighten up my tone a little bit, just kind of blocking in where I want these trees to live. Because of the perspective I want to achieve, that tree that's over there on the left is the largest one. I want that to feel a lot closer to me. So it's going to be bigger and it's going to be lighter in color. So over here, I'm coming in with a bit more of some lighter tones on that right side of the tree to help build up a little texture, kind of plot out where I want that light to be hitting it, and really helping to feel like it's coming into the focus more of my painting. Ultimately, this is kind of my mid-ground in my painting, so these aren't going to have the most detail as far as trees go. It's not my focus for the painting. It's kind of just like a nice little creek liner, as you'll see when we finish this series, hopefully in the next month. But, you know, maybe they're already posted when you're watching this. So I'm adding another tree here. This one's a lot more light in green tones as far as the base. It's closer to me, so that's how I'm starting my base here. This one, I think, was a mix of, it looks like a sap green mixed with yellow oxide. I think I mentioned it before, but I'm going for more of a Central Oregon kind of high desert Cascade Range sort of tree here. So sometimes they do have a little bit more earthy colors than a lot of the dense, lush colors that you would see in more of the Western Oregon scape. All right, tree trunks. They're really pretty simple. So I've got a brown here. I'm using a burnt umber and a chisel brush or a square brush, like a flat wash kind of small one works for that too. Whatever makes your heart happy. And I'll go put it a kind of a dark brown in. I'll lighten it up and put a few quick little brush strokes in for tree bark underneath the tree on that right side. But because I want to feel like this is a nice lush tree, I'm coming in with a little shadow right underneath my bottom tree line for where that tree trunk is. We want to feel like there's some hardly any light like catching that tree trunk there before it goes into our grasses or our marshy meadows. We can have a whole other class about tree trunks and how the roots come into the ground and all that stuff. So that's a different day. That's not this day. I usually like to add the tree trunks after I've put a few of my trees in, just because I don't know what trees we're going to end up in the front. I don't like to have a lot of sunlight on a dense forest, coming through, so you're not going to necessarily see all of your tree trunks shining through. So I like to kind of go through and pepper them in. The further away the tree trunk is in my perspective, so the further I get to the right side of the canvas, the smaller the tree trunks will be. And if you've got like really skinny trees, maybe you'll just have like a little liner brush put in a bit of a brown line tucked in behind your dense trees. Now you don't always have a full dense tree that's covering up your branches all the way around. So here, I'm going to have a few spaces where that trunk is actually showing through the branches, and then later I'll come in and put some greens and some darker tones to kind of blend that back in. So here you can see, I'm going to go back over the top of it, but I like a little sneaky peek sometimes, especially if you're in more arid climates. You will have trees where the trunk will show through those branches, and then you can come in and shade it back in. You can add a little bit more texture on top of it. I'm right here, I'm putting a little bit more green on top of that tree trunk I picked it in, set back in further. But it helps break it up, helps it feel a little bit more natural if you want to, but it's just an option that you can take. And so now that I have the layout of my forest really plotted in, I'm going to go through and do more detail. So when I'm using a liner brush, these little ones that I want careful spaces, I roll it in the paint almost like I'm sharpening a pencil, and that helps me get the fine tips so that I can get these thin lines like this. And it's just nice, like little detail stuff, little extras. I usually wait to do the fine line work until I have the bulk of my big work done. I don't want to spend a bunch of time doing really careful things and then have it all get covered up with big, messy brush strokes. I feel like that's not fair to me. That's not fair to all the work I did. But when I'm doing like little teeny tiny ones, I'll start with a light color and then I'll move to the dark so that it's like helps me blend in a little bit of a shadow. So the top of the tree was still catching a lot of sun, but as I come further down, I'm bringing in some darker shades here so that it feels like it's in the shadow of the tree that it's next to. And I do that as I go so I don't have to go back over it and cover it up later. But I'm kind of just messing up whatever paint I've got left on my brush before I go in with another load of paint to darken it up a little bit more. You can see there's a little bit more of a shadow in there. So by the end of it, I'm getting close to black there, so I have a nice deep shadow. But we're just building that nice like gradation as we go. So now I'm going to put in a little bit of a meadow, my creek bank. I always find it nice to have a little bit of a change up in what I'm painting to help refresh my mind. So I'm going to go paint this little meadowy area in, and then I can come in with a nice fresh view on the trees that I've painted before I bring in detail work. So I'm using like a sap green here as the base, and then I'll come in either like a darker shade of green or mix in a little black with it and do some really rough just brush strokes underneath the trees. So it feels like it's the shadows of the tree like nesting into your grasses or your dirts or whatever you want it to be. Which, coming back into it, I'm going to be adding some highlights into my trees. So sometimes I like to get a little contrasty here. I'm bringing in a pretty bright yellow-green for the highlight on the trees, and then I'll bring in like a little bit of that yellow oxide and green mix. But I'm just doing like little touches, and I'm going to keep the highlights to these trees closer to the tree tops. I'll only bring down those highlights further to the tree bases for the trees I really want to have in the focus. I just said trees so much there. Sorry if I have a lisp. Now, the AC was really hot that day, so the fan wouldn't stop making noise, and I couldn't speak directly to the camera. So this is my voiceover. But that's your happy little trees. We've done it. Look at them. They're gorgeous. I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that you've learned some more. The next tutorial that we're going to do is going to be like a creek side, so follow along and I'll teach you more.